A very good evening to all of you. Thank you all for being here. So today we are here to listen to the lecture presented by Professor Scott Roulier. And we are here for as a part of the dialogue, which is a seminar series of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar. So Professor Scott, I should begin with a brief bio of Professor Scott. He received his Ph.D. in politics from the University of Virginia and currently occupies the David Trimble Chair of Political Philosophy at Lyon College. He teaches courses primarily in political theory and constitutional law, and his secondary teaching interests include urban politics and environmental politics. He has also been named the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching Arkansas Professor of the Year. Sir has also authored 2 books, Kantian Virtue of the Intersection of Politics and Nature and Shaping American Democracy, Landscapes and Urban Design. He has also been a recipient of both a German Academic Exchange Service Fellowship and a Fulbright Fellowship, and has been a scholar in residence at Tübingen University, Germany and Massey University of New Zealand. For the last 8 years, Sir has also been the co-investigator of a longitudinal study of mental and civic health in several slum communities in the Mexico City basin. He is also currently a Fulbright Fellow at the Citizenship University in Ahmedabad. To provide just a brief abstract of what Professor Scott shall be talking about today, this lecture will provide a critical interpretation of Partha Chatterjee's postcolonial democratic theory, especially his civil society and political society model. It will be argued that there is some validity to Chatterjee's claim that after independence, the Indian state adopted many of the values and governing strategies of the British Raj, that it and bourgeois society more generally is committed to a pedagogical project of modernization. These insights undergird a legitimate hermeneutics of suspicion that can attune citizens to new forms of colonial governmentality. Nevertheless, it will also be suggested that many of the philosophical categories and concepts one encounters in Chatterjee's theory are unnecessarily restrictive, sapping, and undercutting the political community's capacity to tackle its most pressing social problems. We now would like to invite Professor onto stage for his talk. Followed by the talk, we shall also be having a question and answer session. Thank you all for being here.
So I think you can hear me okay, right? So thank you so much for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm glad I get to be, it appears to me like maybe the guinea pig, the first person in a long time to do maybe an in-person kind of talk. Maybe there's been other in-person talks, but probably not for a while. So I'm grateful that you're indulging me and allowing me to actually come to Gandhinagar and see real human beings instead of just seeing people. I'm kind of tired of interacting with people online. I mean, Zoom is great, but I'm kind of tired of that. So the only other prefatory remark that, there we go. The only other prefatory remark that I would like to make is that this work on Chatterjee is something, I don't want to disappoint you, I'm just starting it. So I came to Ahmedabad in early January as Omicron was sort of taking off. I've been working on another project in the US. So what you're going to get is not a fully wrought, nuanced, complete, end of my project. You're kind of getting the beginning of my thinking about Chatterjee. I hope you still, are able to take something away from that. But part of the burden is on you. If you see me intellectually speaking about ready to careen off of a cliff with my interpretations of Chatterjee, then please divert my path and prevent me from doing that. So you see the title here, Partha Chatterjee's Postcolonial Democratic Theory, Insights and Limitations. Undoubtedly, everybody in this room knows what this is. This is the Radcliffe line, right, that separates India and Pakistan. And this line, as you know, was announced on August 17, 1947, set off a tidal wave of human migration as Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims were crisscrossing this border, seeking what they hoped would be the safest national harbor for them. And tragically, again, as everybody knows, not everybody made it to their destinations. And we have historians sitting here who kind of know the number, anywhere from 200,000 people to 2 million people were, lost their lives. And so one of the things that's kind of interesting about this too, I think, is a recognition in hindsight that it wasn't just, I am going to talk about Chatterjee here. This is kind of a framing device, right? So that it wasn't just Jinnah and the Muslim League that was interested in partition, but of course we know that the British too had an interest in splitting India into two separate states. Because the British realized that, if you had an independent Pakistan, that Pakistan was going to need certain security assurances, that Pakistan would need sort of financial support. And so the British also maneuvered behind the scenes to some degree to make this happen. When you turn to Chatterjee, you learn about another partition. You learn about another line in Indian society, but this one's not an international border. It's a domestic divide. And unlike the Radcliffe line, it's not necessarily something that you can draw on a map. It's something that is both visible and invisible to us. And what this line is, it separates, it partitions, as it were, Indian society into two separate spheres. This is what Chatterjee argues: civil society and political society. But just like the Radcliffe line, which can be traced back to sort of British colonialism, that this line too, the partition between civil society and political society, is also kind of a form of, it's a scar that is on the Indian Commonwealth because of its colonial past. So what I want to do today is argue that just as we have here's one microphone, this microphone, that in order to understand what Chatterjee is up to, I'd like to just kind of walk us through this very quickly, to think about Chatterjee's work from three different angles. So the first angle would be to think about civil society. And some of you, I don't know how many of you have really engaged Chatterjee's work. Maybe some people here are experts on Chatterjee. But to begin trying to define each sphere in its distinctness. And then a second angle would be to ask the question, how does political society and civil society, how do these entities interact? How do they mutually influence one another? How do they get entangled? And then the third way of looking at this would be, this is, I think, my kind of takeaway, is to think about civil society and political society as being in a kind of dynamic stalemate. So let's begin with this first task. So what does Chatterjee mean by civil society? Well, civil society for Chatterjee is something different than maybe we would think. I mean, most of us would say, well, every Indian is part of civil society. Everyone's a citizen. And Chatterjee would say, well, yeah, but realistically speaking, that's not true at all. That's not really what's happening. The way that Chatterjee defines civil society is kind of this in a kind of Hegelian way. So Hegel talks about civil society as this bourgeois civil society. So what is this? This is a place where people enter into business agreements. This is a place where people actually have title to their property. And if that's the way you define it, that only a small percentage of people in India actually live in civil society. And they tend to be somewhat sequestered. So I'm living in Ahmedabad right now. So stereotypically, where is civil society? Well, it's in Alpha One Mall. It's in the gleaming office buildings along the Sabarmati riverfront. It's the people living in the bungalows behind sort of gated communities. I mean, that's civil society for Chatterjee. And the other thing here is that how to ask ourselves the question, how do people in civil society see people in political society? And Chatterjee argues that civil society, members of civil society don't always see people in political society as individuals, but they see them as groups, as populations, as administrative categories, as demographic groupings. And that means that their orientation toward political society is what he calls pedagogical. Basically, they need to manage political society. They need to normalize political society. Now, For its part, political society is a heterogeneous area of lots of different religious sects and castes and maybe sometimes criminal elements, Chatterjee says. And he wants, if civil society is this realm, to use a kind of Foucauldian sort of term, if civil society is this space of governmentality, then political society is really the space of democracy. And I think some of us might find that strange, because we think of democracy as being what happens here in Gandhinagar, right? That's what happens in Delhi. These are formal democratic institutions. That's where democracy really plays out. And Chatterjee wants to say, no, no, no. If democracy is about people governing themselves, the real space of democracy is political society. That's where the demands of the common person are channelized. That's where Indians, actually most Indians, mobilize to gain concessions from civil society. And Chatterjee's also going to argue that political society is irreducibly political. Why is it irreducibly political? Well, because people in political society live on the knife's edge. There's nothing that's guaranteed from day to day. You have an illegal business, you might set it up one place and you might get shut down the next day. You're in a squatter community, you might have a home today, but you may not tomorrow. So it's irreducibly political, because unlike someone who has a title to property where you can expect to wake up the next morning and you're going to have your house, that you have to, on a daily basis, negotiate your existence. It's political. You have to constantly negotiate your existence. So these are, just some of the ways that we think about political and civil society. Each one of these spheres faces a dilemma. Each one of these spheres is hung up on the horns of a dilemma. What's the dilemma for civil society? The dilemma for civil society is it, to some extent, acknowledges some of the moral claims that are raised on behalf of people in political society, but the state doesn't really have the capacity to guarantee the social service, all the social services and the rights that are demanded. And so it kind of has to do these little pragmatic workarounds. The dilemma for a political society is that it acknowledges to some degree that it transgresses the law and order, but it's going to improvise anyway because you have to survive. And so in each one of these spheres is this kind of a living contradiction to some degree. They acknowledge that they're operating in ways that may not be wholly consistent, but they have to operate that way anyway. And this brings us to just this idea of the post-colonial, again, which some of you have engaged with a lot. So why would I call this, or why would Chatterjee's work be considered kind of post-colonial democratic theory? Well, you think about nationalists like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay and Nehru, and they basically had to birth the Indian state, not by themselves. I mean, these people are also historically disconnected, but there's been a period of time, over a period of time, the Indian sort of state, Indian independence had been brewing for a very long time. They had to sort of, do this within the belly of the beast. But at the same time, these same national leaders didn't want to completely throw the baby out with the bathwater. They wanted to, they still liked Western science and its progeny technology, but they wanted to sort of hybridize that and connect that with indigenous sort of Indian ideas, because they thought that probably from a spiritual standpoint that India was superior. So they wanted to sort of pull all those things together. They wanted to preserve those. Sorry about that. But in the event, what Chatterjee says is that the Western part definitely won out over the Indian part. And to that degree, these leaders of Indian independence were, he says, basically prisoners of European modes of thought. And to the degree that these leaders of Indian independence wanted desperately to take India and turn it into a modern nation state in the mold of other Western states, meant that in the end, they basically just perpetuated colonization in India. That's the argument. So you don't have to believe that. That's Chatterjee's argument. All right. So I was going to just give one quick example of this, just because I was reading this book. Some of you are familiar with Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. How many people read that novel? It's a great novel. If you haven't read it, you should read it. So I finally got a chance. I've been wanting to read it for years, but here I'm in India. We're online at Seth. I have nothing to do anyway, so I'll read this novel. And in the novel, there are a number of allusions to this kind of post-colonial reality that Chatterjee is talking about. And there's a chapter called Methwold. And what's happening in the novel when this chapter sort of enters in the novel is that the British Raj is just about ready to hand over the reins of government to the independence leaders. And there's this character, one of Rushdie's characters named William Methwold, and he is the descendant of an 18th century East India Company officer. And he lives in Mumbai, and he's about ready to sell a house he has the biggest estate in Mumbai, and sell one of his villas. It's called Buckingham Villa. And the deal is, though, that he doesn't want to transfer the property unless people meet certain conditions. So what are the conditions? He's going to sell his villa to some Indian people, and he's not going to move any of his furniture. He will not move the furniture. The furniture will stay. And not only will the furniture stay, but the furniture is supposed to stay exactly as it was on his departure. And basically what Methwold's doing here is insisting that the material culture of his estate remain exactly as it was, right? And one of the interesting things is, so these people who are buying the property, Indians, move on to the estate. Methwold's still there because he's hanging out until the day of independence. And they're getting familiarized with sort of Western amenities, and Methwold's throwing these really cool cocktail parties. And at first, the Indian people buying the estate are kind of freaked out by some of these amenities. They don't really know what to do with them. And they also think this cocktail weird thing, they don't really know what this cocktail party is, but it doesn't take them long, according, in the novel. They start to love the amenities. These are cool. The cocktail parties are pretty cool. And the narrator of the novel says this. I'll read it over here so it doesn't whine. Every evening at 6, they, the Indian owners-to-be, are out in their gardens celebrating the cocktail hour. When William Methwold comes to call, they slip effortlessly into their imitation Oxford drawls. And they are learning about ceiling fans and gas cookers. And Methwold, supervising their transformation, is mumbling under his breath. Listen carefully. What's he saying? Yes, that's it. Sab kuch tik tak hai, mumbles Methwold. All is well. Right? Like Salim Sinai's family is going to maintain Methwold's estate, the leaders of independent India are basically going to maintain the Raj. They might change the name, might say it's a new India, but basically they're keeping the estate. They're keeping the material culture. That's the idea. So we've looked at civil society and political society and their distinctness. What about how they interact with one another? Civil society, insofar as it tries to manage political society, is going to constantly enter into negotiations on a daily basis, again, with it. And what you have to realize is that the officials in civil society have to engage in cost-benefit analysis. Let's say that they're asked to remove some pavement dwellers. They're asked to evict some slum dwellers because some businesses, middle-class businesses don't want them around, or some middle-class citizens are tired of them being around. So the on the bottom municipal corporations getting sort of pushed and pressured to remove these people. And so, but each one of these decisions for actors in civil society is context dependent. They have to think to themselves, well, wait a minute, what if this particular community is tied to a powerful political party, the clients of a powerful political party? What if this particular group of slum dwellers actually is providing necessary labor to a major infrastructure project in Ahmedabad? And if we remove them, they're not going to be there. They have to make these kinds of calculations. And what I'm saying here is that basically they get their hands dirty. This is what Chatterjee is saying. They get their hands dirty. They act arbitrarily. Civil society is supposed to be the realm of law and order, right? It's okay to say, right? You don't have to do call and response. It's supposed to be the realm of law and order. But what's happening is they're acting in an arbitrary fashion. You're pirating electricity, I'm going to look the other way. But this group over here, I'm going to cut off their electricity. Right? This group, I'm going to kick you out. This group, I'm going to look the other way. Constantly getting their hands dirty and kind of tainting themselves, betraying their own commitment to law and order. All right, so even more uncomfortable for many of these people and officials in civil society is the fact they get drawn into subaltern sort of different kinds of cultural and religious practices. So one of the examples that, this is not Chatterjee's example, this is Scott Roulier's example, having lived in Ahmedabad for a short period of time, but one of the things I find interesting that fits in with Chatterjee is this idea of roadside shrines. Y'all know, and I'm from the southern part of the US, so it's sort of a, y'all means you all, you guys, whatever you say here. So you know what roadside shrines are. And so these often though are what, erected by subaltern groups. These are often, they're erected by subaltern groups. They're maybe taken care of by local roadside vendors, other kinds of things. Now, there's a scholar named Gauri Bhatt, and she basically reminds us that these are again, they're not the kind of typical deity that in a kind of Hindu pantheon that's worshipped. These are very different. These are subaltern deities. And that one of the contexts that she provides is that in the midst of Hindutva politics, and in Hindutva politics, most of you again know more about this than I, but part of what's happening is that what it means to be a Hindu is being defined very much by sort of middle and upper class people, upper castes. And there's an attempt to elide or to sort of erase some of the differences within Hindu sects so you can eventually have a more sort of consistent idea of what it means to be a Hindu and ultimately politically to have more of a monolithic sort of political powerhouse that you can deal with. What's interesting about these roadside shrines, as I said, is they represent a different stream of Hinduism. It's an alternative interpretation of Hinduism. Again, these deities that are being worshipped in these roadside shrines are mostly from sort of, family networks and from maybe sort of other sort of lower caste groups. And so one of the things that, one of the things that happens is that these roadside shrines are constantly encroaching on public space. So they're in street medians, they're on sidewalks. And as that happens, I'm sort of in a quote here from a scholar named Ayet Bayat, who says, he calls this quiet encroachment, the silent, protracted, but pervasive advancement of ordinary people in relation to the property and powerful in order to survive and improve their lives. So there are these subaltern practices. So how does the state or how does civil society actually deal with these? Well, these roadside shrines, I don't have to tell you, are incredibly popular. And so because they're so popular, the state or the municipal corporation can't afford to mistreat them. So in fact, what you find is many of these roadside shrines are rarely demolished. They're rarely erased. Even if a slum community is evicted, the shrines will still be there. It's not just that the corporation, the municipal corporation accommodates these subaltern practices, they also sometimes leverage them for civic purposes. So there's an example of a city that basically puts up a big poster. And the poster says, if you don't throw your trash away, if you don't dispose of your trash the right way, then the deity Meldi Mata, who is I guess, associated with the Wagri sort of community, is you will incur the wrath of Meldi Mata. So the city is leveraging people's beliefs about this particular deity. And this deity supposedly sort of was born to defeat or vanquish an asura or a demon who is able to hide in dirt. But why is this even important? What's my point? It's important because if you are a bourgeois, if you're part of civil society, you're in the public realm, you're supposed to think about science and rationality and all those kinds of things. You're not supposed to be messing around with some subaltern deity and putting that on posters in your city. So what Chatterjee's point would be is that civil society gets entangled. It gets pulled into this kind of subaltern world, even though they're trying to say remain above it. What about political society? Well, for its part, it also gets entangled. It has to, on a daily basis, as I said, deal with officials, having to negotiate all the time. But there's another interesting thing that happens according to Chatterjee, and that is that what you begin to see is that as people mobilize in political society, and as these groups are trying to sort of gain some sort of consensus about a matter, that people are, at least Chatterjee argues, less and less deferential to some of those traditional leaders. They begin to demand more representativeness. They begin to demand a little more transparency. And what Chatterjee is saying here, what happens is, even though the halls, the hallowed halls of New Delhi and parliamentary politics are over here, that you begin to see creeping into political society groups a little bit of a kind of demand for a bourgeois principle of representation and transparency. That doesn't happen everywhere, but so there's mutual influence, right? Civil society is influenced by political society, and political society is influenced by civil society. So it's not like they're just totally separate spheres. Okay. The stalemate. That the state prioritizes governmentality means that generally members of political society are viewed as passive, as mere clients of the state, not really as subjects. But what Chatterjee says, and here's the deal, Chatterjee is way more of a fan, if I put it that way, of political society than he is of civil society. He's a huge fan of political society. And he's saying that what's happening in political society is you see the development of new innovative practices and institutions that are sort of forming in political society that are kind of an implicit critique of the way bourgeois politics are played out. But even more important, probably the most critical thing for Chatterjee about political society is this is a space in which new ideas of community are coming into being. What do I mean by that? These are ideas of community that transcend religion and caste to some degree. And it's important because political society then is a space where this idea of belonging, a sense of belonging, is incredibly important for all of our human development. And yet, Chatterjee says, it's something that civil society is unprepared to do, because civil society is all about your individual lives. Civil society does a terrible job of giving you a sense of belonging, but political society gives you a sense of belonging. What about civil society? Well, civil society could be seen as a space of transformation. Since the implementation of the neoliberal reforms, what you see is more economic growth in India, right? More economic growth. I mean, I'm in Ahmedabad, I see, bus rapid transit system, there's a sovereign riverfront, there are new buildings going, it's just a construction site. I mean, the built environment is being transformed by civil society. But Chatterjee doesn't see this as a transformational space ultimately, because he thinks that what happens in civil society is that what it means to be human has been narrowed down to capital accumulation and consumption. In short, it's what Nietzsche talked about, the last man who winks and says, I'm satisfied. In other words, it's about consumption. It's about just people kind of glutting their petty bourgeois souls. It's basically what Chatterjee would say. It's kind of a narrow idea of what it means to be human. So where, again, does this leave us? Well, what we've seen is that there is some transformation in political society, but the thing here is that political society, unlike neoliberalism, which wants globalization, or unlike Marxism, a lot of these other isms have big aspirations to change the world. Political society doesn't want to change the global order. Instead, Chatterjee says, essentially, they are kind of stuck, and he's going to imitate Foucault here and say they're kind of stuck just having to resist, just having to kind of maneuver within a field of power. That's really all that they can do. So there is no big picture. I mean, no big aspirations of major social change. So where I think that leaves us with Chatterjee is that kind of this stalemate where civil society is going to constantly try to normalize and sort of manage political society. Political society is going to resist being managed and normalized. But at the end of the day, we kind of have, I'm an American, sort of a Madisonian standoff, kind of checks and balances, where even though there's kind of some interaction between these two spheres, really what's going on is whatever I learn about your sphere, I'm going to use to protect my own turf. So social learning just enables me to better protect my own sphere. Now, is this a good or a bad thing? Well, I'm just going to give an initial impression here that what I think is that there is some value for sure in what Chatterjee is doing. I mean, we'll see this a little bit more in a second, but he definitely he sort of traces the continuities between the British Raj and civil society and how the various governance strategies of the British are basically taken over by an independent India. And so what that does for us, if you read post-colonial theory, what it should do is give you, a healthier dose of skepticism. It should help you take up a posture of maybe a hermeneutics of suspicion, where you're more dialed into what is the state really doing? What's the purpose of what they're doing? So I think that's important, that kind of post-colonial, it raises awareness and sensitivity. The problem, it seems to me, is that what Chatterjee's work basically obscures as much as it illuminates. And I think that part of the problem is that the way that Chatterjee defines certain terms, the way he defines certain traditions or categories, leads us to the standoff. I'm not saying that he's completely wrong. I think he's right about a number of different things. But I worry that there's not much space in this civil society, political society binary for a workable democracy, right? I mean, people want democracy to actually work, to get things done. And so I referenced this book, Democracy is Problem Solving by Xavier de Souza Briggs. Look, autocracy is a lot easier. If we had the autocracy of Scott Roulier, I could cut through the Gordian knots. I wouldn't have to listen to you. I wouldn't have to ask you for your input. I could just tell you what to do, right? Now, I don't want to do that. Why? Because I'm not the smartest person in the room. I doubt it. I certainly probably am not. I would like to crowdsource my problem solving. The reason democracy is valuable is because it lets us crowdsource problem solving. I get to use all of your intelligence, all of your ideas, all of your creativity. That's why democracy should be better. But if we are stuck in two different political societies or two different political cultures, then it's very difficult for us to tackle the biggest challenges that India has, or the US has, but we're talking about India in a post-colonial context here. So ultimately, my critique of Chatterjee is not that he gets everything wrong. I think he gets a lot of things right. I'm afraid that his post-colonial theory, though, at the end, if he is right, doesn't leave us a lot of space for bridging the divide of cross-sector collaboration, of creating even just a minimal agenda of things that people can work on together that influence and sort of influence the life of every single person in India, regardless of whether they're in civil society or political society. So that's my concern. So in Chatterjee's mind, it's kind of like there are two islands and these ships that sort of sail back and forth. And when you disembark in one of the islands, you realize, oh man, this political culture here is much different than this island over here. This political culture in political society is much different than the political culture in civil society. It's really, these are two different kind of entities at the end of the day. And again, my concern here, my argument, is that the reason that seems that way is because of the way Chatterjee sets up his argument. So I just want to use one example as I just have a couple more slides left. The one example I want to use, and there's many that I could use, is his idea of liberalism, the way he characterizes a liberal democracy. So Chatterjee talks about liberalism in its classical sense, which is totally fine. And so what do we mean by classical liberalism? Well, the tenets of classical liberalism would be things like, the sanctity of private property, the allegiance to the rule of law, the individual is a building block of society, protection of individual rights, all those kinds of things. And as we've seen, political society doesn't always comply. And so you're stuck if you're, attached to this liberal model of constantly having to sort of make compromises. Okay, so one of the things that Chatterjee points out, if this is the liberal model, political society isn't really cooperating. But this is the same problem that the British had. And so what did the British do? Well, the British couldn't get Indian people to sort of sync up with and align with their values any more than modern Indians and civil society can get political society to line up with their values. And so what they did is they came up with a strategy, a norm deviation, norm exception strategy, which basically meant Indians were going to deviate from the universal norm of what it means to be a well-behaved human. I'm being sarcastic, obviously, right? That was to the British, so they're upset about that. So obviously Indians can't be British, so we'll have to they're deviating from the standard. So we'll have to come up with all sorts of exceptions. And basically what Chatterjee is saying is this is exactly what civil society is doing, the same kind of thing, a pragmatic accommodation. The problem, Chatterjee says, though, is philosophically, that both the British and civil society were compromising their liberal values of treating people as individuals and all these other kinds of things. So if civil society is predominantly liberal, it's not going to want to interact with political society very often. If it's going to try to refrain from that, because every time it does, it basically has to betray its own values. Because if it has to treat them as groups, that kind of betrays its own values. If it has to, this I think is one of the problems of trying to bridge the divide between political society and civil society. If you define civil society as classically liberal, though that classically liberal orientation is not going to give you any impetus to really try to collaborate with political society. But I don't think that Chatterjee's idea of liberalism is the only idea of liberalism. And what I want to do is, I think it's cramped. It's a cramped view of liberalism. And I want to illustrate this by talking about squatters' rights in India. Use this as an illustration, kind of a case study. So, some of you are familiar with this. This is a famous Indian Supreme Court case in 1985 in India. And what happens, there's a bunch of slum dwellers, pavement dwellers in Mumbai who petitioned the government for relief from a Mumbai sort of ordinance that was going to evict them from their areas. And they petitioned the government and they grounded their argument in Article 21 of the Indian Constitution. Article 21 of the Indian Constitution basically refers to this idea that you should not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, without establishing the right kind of procedure. And looking at Article 21, what the Indian Supreme Court said is this. I'm going to just read just a little snippet from the ruling in Old Gatellis. Here's what the court said. The question which we have to consider is whether the right to life includes the right to livelihood. We see only one answer to that question, namely that it does. The sweep of the right to life conferred by Article 21 is wide and far-reaching. That which alone makes it possible to live, leave aside what it means to be livable, must be deemed to be an integral component of the right to life. They read it very broadly. And essentially what the Supreme Court said is if you're going to evict somebody, number one, you have to provide prior notification. Number two, if you're going to evict a community, you have to provide compensatory shelter. Now, the first part of that ruling isn't surprising. And actually, it comports with a kind of classical liberal understanding of Article 21. It's basically saying, if you're going to hurt somebody, first you have to notify them in time. You can hurt them all you want. You can take their lives away. You can take their liberty away. You just have to use the right kind of process, right? Now, but the second part of the ruling, which is about compensatory shelter, that's a totally different thing. The Supreme Court is not just telling the government that it has to refrain from doing something, it's telling the government that it has to affirmatively do something. It has to essentially give people substantive, positive rights, which is a very different kind of thing. What this means is that, in many respects, in this case, the Indian Supreme Court was expanding the scope of individual rights into expanding the scope of government, even though that's not really consistent with maybe what we normally think of as liberalism. But I want to hasten to add here that by broadening the scope of individual rights and by broadening governmental power, that the Supreme Court in India in this ruling is not actually violating liberal principles. So it is true that within liberalism, there is a classically liberal group, or libertarian group, and for them, the whole point is to have an emaciated state, a very small, limited state. The job of the state is to make sure that you and I don't get into collisions with one another. I don't know how that doesn't happen more. Driving through Ahmedabad, I'm completely amazed. I don't know how to explain to people in the US what's like to drive around Ahmedabad when people are going in all these different directions. But somehow the state's supposed to keep us from colliding with one another, right? And all the goodies that we have, all the wealth and property that we have, by the way, if you're libertarian, that means that you are absolutely entitled to your property. And if taxes are theft, and you basically shouldn't redistribute any of that stuff. That's, that kind of idea within liberalism certainly exists. But there are other notions of liberalism. And a good example is this is from Martha Nussbaum. Some of you probably are familiar with Nussbaum and Sen, some of their work. And Nussbaum is a liberal. Now, her approach methodologically to liberalism is a little bit different. She kind of departs from the way that liberals tend to theorize. So for example, John Rawls would say, the way that liberal theory should work is you have to establish the right before the good. The right before the good. That's the mantra. What does he mean? He means that you establish the rules of the game first, and then the government remains neutral vis-a-vis all of our decisions about how we want to live. That's what that looks like. Now, Nussbaum would say, well, that makes no sense. Aristotle could have told you that a long time ago. You can't design a game. You can't design rules of a game. You can't design a government without what? First knowing what your goal is. What are your purposes? You can't do that without knowing the good in advance. In other words, there's no such thing as complete neutrality. You always already have within your game or within your theory, you have ideas, purposes, goods embedded in them. So for Nussbaum, what is the good that government ought to make sure that it achieves? Well, what she would say is there are 10 human capabilities. She does cross-cultural sort of empirically normed studies, and she identifies 10 things that every human being, qua human being, ought to be able to do or to be. But it's not enough just to identify 10 things that humans ought to be able to do or be. The other thing is, she talks about combined capabilities, which means that you need to make sure that the government provides the accompanying social infrastructure so that you can exercise those capabilities. That means you can't just say, hey, you have capabilities. You also have to make sure you educate people. You also need to make sure that you give them healthcare. So what she's doing is she's, again, broadening the scope here, but she's straying away from the idea of a small state. She's straying away from this idea that we have to have a very narrow catalog of rights, but she's still liberal. Why is she still liberal? Here's why. Because she distinguishes between capabilities and human functioning. She's saying you ought to be able to exercise certain capabilities, but the government isn't going to force you to function in a certain way. That is ultimately what Nussbaum does, is she safeguards and preserves this really important liberal idea of your individual autonomy. So the government can build recreational infrastructure. The government can build sort of new walkways and bikeways and all these kinds of things so you can get out and walk and not have heart disease and diabetes. But the government can't impose a diet on you. They can't give you the government diet that everyone has to sort of live up to. So there's a difference between giving people opportunities and capabilities and actually functioning. But the point here is that from a libertarian idea of liberalism to Nussbaum, both of these is sort of on a continuum. And what you see in Chatterjee, in order to set up his argument, that he tends to sort of follow on this kind of very narrow definition of liberalism, which makes it hard to interact with political society. If you have Martha Nussbaum's view of liberalism, it's a lot easier to sort of have collaborative efforts with political society. Interestingly, in the 21st century, so we looked at the Olga Tellez case, I want to talk about one last case. The Supreme Court became more conservative. Surprise, surprise. So in the 21st century in India, it became more conservative. And there's another case, very similar to the Olga Tellez case, about evicting slum dwellers. And here's what the court said in this case. This is the Almitra Patel versus Union of India. And in that particular ruling, the court said this: these slum dwellers are, quote, usurpers, encroachers, and criminals. And, quote, they are guilty of a private appropriation of the commons, unquote. And the Supreme Court warned that if you give people compensatory shelter, they will just break the law more and more. So this is a different, this is actually more in line with, in some ways, the way that Chatterjee describes liberalism, but it makes my point. My point is that there's actually a range of ideas about what liberalism means. Okay, so it is possible to still be a liberal and to not feel like you are tainted by thinking about human capabilities, by using your idea of human dignity and wanting to sort of work with political society, not just to discipline them, not just to normalize them, not just to sort of in some Foucauldian way to whatever to control them, but from a liberal standpoint, the possibility of sort of leveraging human dignity. The second and the last sort of issue about how we think about liberalism is this: what does liberalism say about citizenship? Well, Chatterjee, again, is right. He contends that civil society advocates for universal formal citizenship, which means that each one of us in this room should get the same bucket of rights. I don't care what your race, religion, your background, your gender. In a universal form of citizenship, every single person here ought to get the exact same endowment of rights and privileges. He's right. That's the way liberals tend to do that. But if that's the assumption, then my question for you is this: is India a liberal democracy? And I ask that question because if you look at the Indian Constitution, there's an intricate set of rights, not individual rights, I mean, there are individual rights that are protected by the Indian Constitution, but the Indian Constitution is built around group differentiated citizenship. We know this, right? So there are, 4 different religious groups that are able through civil law to essentially mostly control what happens within sort of their own religious cultural practices. We know that there are linguistic rights within the people treated as linguistic groups. That's why we have Gujarat and Maharashtra. I mean, we actually went through that. If you look at a map of India, it's basically looking at people's linguistic groups. And we have scheduled tribes, right? And they get special representation at the state level, the national level. And I can multiply and multiply examples. We're all aware of this. We're not treating people like individuals. We're treating people like groups. And so the question is, is this some sort of violation of liberalism? And again, I think the answer would be not necessarily. Now, before I tell you why that's not necessarily a liberal, this quick observation that Chatterjee makes, which I think is important. And that is that the British Raj also treated people like groups. Divide and rule strategy. And so they set up different representative institutions for Hindus and Muslims. And there's scholars that would agree with Chatterjee, and they say, yeah, the whole point here was to drive a wedge between these religious communities. And to drive a wedge, the British didn't care about cultural diversity. They weren't setting up a special representation for Hindus and Muslims because they cared about cultural diversity. They're doing that to create a wedge. They did that because they wanted to, in the long run, be able to control the Indian population better. And ultimately, this is part of their civilizing mission. Now, but these same scholars would also depart from Chatterjee and say, look, you can't just see the Indian Constitution and these group differentiated rights as sort of coming directly from the Raj and just as a kind of post-colonial phenomenon. Because the leaders of the independence movement in India also, it wasn't just that they were trying to sort of take over these colonial sort of strategies. They actually cared about diversity. And they cared about diversity in this way. They wanted to make sure that marginalized and minority communities, number one. And they also wanted to make sure that you wanted to make sure that people were not, not only were they not discriminated against, but they had, the same kinds of opportunities. They weren't to assimilate to the dominant culture. So it's not just a colonial strategy. Now, it could be, 2 things can be true at once. It can be true that the Constitution really cares about diversity. It could also be true that there are subtle operations of colonial thought that were there too. That's possible, right? But I think the bigger point here, and as I'm kind of bringing this to an end, about group differentiated rights. Again, Chatterjee's view is civil society is incredibly uncomfortable with group differentiated rights. It has to treat people like groups, but doesn't like. It betrays its own values, but does it anyway, and that's why it doesn't really want to deal with political society if it can avoid it. But there are lots of liberal theorists, especially a lot of Canadian. You have the Quebecois, you have indigenous groups in Canada. And these liberals will say, you can have group differentiated rights and still be a good liberal. And the argument that's basically there, this is someone like Wilkin Licca. Wilkin Licca would argue, we have like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute, what's my, okay. So Kim Licca would argue that, look, that you need a multicultural society for each one of us to be able to construct our own conception of the good. With multicultural societies, cosmopolitan societies, amazing array of options, philosophically in terms of lifestyles to choose from as each one of us tries to construct our own idea of what we want life to be. That's a great thing. But here's the rub. In order for that multicultural society to exist, you have to have a policy framework that ironically treats people like groups. You have to serve their unique cultures so that you and I can experience those cultures so we can choose from them. And so as long as the point of group differentiated rights is to protect people from unwarranted assimilation of these group differentiated rights is to make sure that we're protecting ultimately, at the end of the day, individual choice, then group differentiated rights actually can be liberal. So again, the way that when you read Chatterjee, Civil society climbs up the fence, they look over the edge of the fence and they see political society. And they go, oh my gosh, this is chaos over there. This is just a morass of, whoa, I mean, we're gonna have to like treat these people like groups and imagine like groups and we're violating our liberal principles. I just don't like dealing with liberal, I don't like dealing with political society. When William Licca, who is a liberal, climbs the fence and looks over the edge, I mean, you know, diversity, that's a positive thing because it supports these other aspects of liberalism like individual choice and dignity and the protection of people from assimilation. So my point here is, if Chatterjee is right about kind of this binary of civil society and political society, I'm arguing, you don't have to agree with me, that there just isn't necessarily enough space for bridge problems. But you don't have to see the world exclusively through Chatterjee's lenses. Because I think that, and I could use lots of other examples which you don't have time for today, about the way he defines civil society very narrowly. He sets his whole theory up to make it difficult, I think, for this kind of movement forward for people that solve democratic problems. So let me just sort of end with this summary. I think that, again, I basically already summarized, but what's good about Chatterjee, right, or even more broadly, which we talk about post-colonial theory, is it's caution to us. It helps us to be more vigilant, especially in countries like India that have a colonial past, to ensure that forms of social control and to ensure that we're supposed to be eradicated because you got rid of the colonial oppressors, that these forms aren't resurrected in some and repackaged in ways that are basically peddled by the Indian national state. So that's what's valuable about it. But even if it can be useful in detecting these kind of repackaged disciplinary tactics, I think it carries with it the unfortunate side effect of obscuring common human interests that exist in all corners of Indian society and tacitly discouraging collaboration between civil times, which creates a stalemate, which makes democracy potentially less resilient and unworkable. So anyway, that's all I have. I think I might have made it under the time. Thank you much.